Putting tech people in charge of the government is a terrible idea. I've covered technology for more than 20 years. I can tell you why, but first I'm going to tell you a story about a bakery. In 2022, was doing a story about inflation, and I went to a local bakery called Semifredi's. That is one of these places that you have near you. I'm sure it's a local bakery that serves all these grocery stores and restaurants. Anyway, they were showing me, the guy who runs it, Tim Frenier, was showing me every step in this amazing process that creates croissants and granola and all kinds of stuff. And he, at the end of the tour, showed me the last stop that all the products make, and that is a metal detector. And I was like, why would you do that? And he said, well, because when, you've seen all the machinery that we have here, at some point, some washer or nut or something is going to come loose and fall into the dough. And I cannot have anybody biting into that in my product. And I was blown away. I just remember being so astounded by that because I am so used to covering the kinds of companies that believe that they get endless do-overs, that they get to, release what they call a minimum viable product, right? The bare bones thing that can get out in the world, and then people will give you feedback on, and you'll work out the kinks over time, but all of it's happening live. And they're always talking about, oh, we're always trying to improve. Whenever you'll hear this from tech CEOs all the time, we're constantly working to improve. Obviously, we have more work to do, that kind of thing. It's a constant refrain because it's a way of not taking responsibility in advance for the unforeseen consequences. And in software, they call that the edge case. There's the use case. That's the thing that, all of us are, that's the stereotypical right down the middle user, customer base, right? That has an obvious use for this thing, the use case and use cases. The edge case is that rare, unforeseen, and some people in software would say unforeseeable effect that's going to cause trouble, but that will work out over time. And the problem is that in software, you tend to believe, basically, the more widely you release your prototype and the more people you subject to it, the more chance you have to work out the kinks over time. You're going to release to more and more and more people, and over time, scale solves your problems. And I just remember being so amazed by this guy who owns this bakery, because I had just interviewed this guy from this company, Midjourney, that you probably know, makes generative AI art. Midjourney's CEO and I were talking, and he was trying to take a pretty good faith, he was making a good faith effort to try to talk about the sort of possible negative implications of his product. And I was actually really bummed because John Oliver on Last Week Tonight pulled my story and used it, and then made a lot of fun of David Holtz's appearance, which I just thought was uncalled for. There's lots to talk about without making fun of how somebody looks. So anyway, I'm talking to David Holtz, and I was asking him, do you think you should be held responsible if somebody misuses your thing? Because somebody had just made, an orange jumpsuit image of President Trump, then former President Trump, and he said, well, if I am a baker and I make 10,000 muffins and someone gets food poisoning, am I supposed to stop making muffins? And I was like, and there was a sort of pause between us, and I was like, yeah, that's what the FDA would say, exactly that. And I never got to sort of say this to Tim Frenier, the guy who owned the bakery, but the difference between those two attitudes was so incredible. So right now, you don't have that baker in charge. You have the other category, the other attitude, the software attitude in charge. And that is an attitude that does not really look for the edge case, doesn't think that it's their job to think about the edge case in advance. But we are already seeing the secondary effects of all sorts of actions on the part of DOGE and the presidential executive orders that we're seeing. The secondary effects go on and on and on. So here's one example, right? So USAID, right? You've seen that that's being shut down. Elon Musk said on a live event on X the other day that he and President Trump had agreed that we need to shut it down. We should shut it down, he said. And a news crew then, was filming USAID's logo being taken off the building in DC. Well, the billions that USAID gives out I think it's more than like $70 billion a year. The discontinued funding includes funding to Gaza, right? So Palestinians in Gaza right now are seeing rising levels of polio, rising levels of cholera. And the direct effects are clear in terms of health. But the secondary effects, I was thinking to myself just how many Palestinians could grow up having experienced the cutoff of support from the United States, and hearing President Trump talking about occupying Gaza, and he's not backing down from that. He keeps talking about it. That could create already this incredible hostility in a generation of Palestinians. I mean, they could be dangerously, violently angry at any American they encounter from now on in their lives, essentially. But here's a way that somebody talked about it to ABC News that I think is exactly, I mean, they're literally talking about the secondary effects. They're literally talking about the edge case here. It's a guy from Refugees International. He said this, quote, "I think one of the facets of this that people are not necessarily connecting is that the humanitarian access to Gaza, which is underpinned by USAID, State Department funds, was a central feature of the bargain that underpins ceasefire. So if you remove aid to Gaza, whether directly or as a second-order effect of aid freeze, this raises the risk of a broader ceasefire collapse." So that is an edge case, right? That you are not taught to think about, to quantify in your product pitch. But Elon Musk's guys are all those kinds of guys. There are engineers who used to work for his various companies or were linked to them in some ways, right? Wired's been doing amazing reporting about this. And those guys are not trained for this. They're trained to iterate, and even at Tesla, which is a hardware company, right? An automotive company, you've seen this kind of let's move fast and break things kind of iterative attitude. And that attitude, I think, is, it's trouble. It can be trouble. Tesla disputes these findings, but studies have shown that that company has some of the, basically the studies have found that Tesla leads the industry in both accidents and fatalities. Tesla takes exception to this. Executives there say that this is they dispute those conclusions. But the regulator, the NHTSA, has raised safety concerns that led to the recall of more than 2 million Teslas. And they concluded that Tesla's autopilot system has, quote, led to foreseeable misuse and avoidable crashes and hundreds of collisions. That company is famous for not being exactly forthcoming with its data, right? Those cars collect an enormous amount of data, but I have colleagues who have covered them for years, and that's not a company that hands over that data very easily. They also, the Cybertruck, which you're seeing increasingly on the roads, isn't currently, has not been subjected to any kind of safety testing by the NHTSA. And that's true of many cars. Jaguars, Land Rovers, other small production number cars have also not been tested. But you as a manufacturer can nominate your vehicle to be tested. Tesla has not done that with the Cybertruck. So now to see the people who sort of come from a culture of software iteration and, like I say, endless do-overs, to see them at work cutting away at the federal government, right? They have access to the federal payment system, which controls the, payments, the provision of benefits to millions of Americans. The National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, they've now gotten access to that. That's, what shares and collects climate data, right? The iterating of, the idea that we're going to sort of turn this stuff off and see if the government functions without it, and pare it down in this destructive way to the very bare bones, skeleton crew kind of operations. I mean, USAID, which had 10,000 people globally, they're supposedly going to cut them down to, 300 full-time staff. The potential secondary effects here are enormous, and these are not people who are trained to do it. They're to think about those things in advance. And so this improvisational attitude that you see in tech is tough. And there's a famous quote from President Obama. In 2016, he was at Carnegie Mellon, and he was speaking on stage extemporaneously, and he was basically saying, government will never run the way that Silicon Valley does because democracy is messy. And he says, he says, here's what he says. Sometimes I talk to CEOs, they come in and they start telling me about leadership and here's how we do things. And I say, well, if all I was doing was making a widget or producing an app, and I didn't have to worry about whether poor people could afford the widget, or I didn't have to worry about whether the app had some unintended consequences, then I think those suggestions are terrific. And, as he pointed out, part of government's job is dealing with problems that nobody else wants to deal with. This is the essence of running a country. And I worry that the folks doing it are only trained in how to run a business.